June 3rd, 1943. Occupied Poland, somewhere east of Radom. The German supply train was 12 cars long, armor-plated at the front and rear, and guarded by 43 soldiers rotating in shifts around the clock. It sat on a reinforced rail spur deep in a pine forest, hidden from Allied reconnaissance aircraft by a canopy of camouflage netting so wide it covered 2 full acres of sky. Inside those 12 cars, 50,000 liters of aviation fuel, crates of artillery shells, and crated engine components destined for the armored divisions gathering near Kursk. The Germans called it Lieferung 1, Delivery 1. The opening move of what would become the largest tank battle in human history. Soviet intelligence had learned of the shipment. British radio operators had passed the coordinates. The Polish Home Army had received the message. Every commander who reviewed the mission shook his head and closed the folder. No one believed it could be done. One man disagreed. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you listening to this story from? Drop your city or country in the comments right now, and let's see which corner of the world has the most war legend fans. Don't just scroll, type it out. Your comment might get featured in the next story. His name was Stefan Kowal, and he was 34 years old. Unremarkable in almost every way that the world typically measures men. He stood 5 feet 8 inches tall with a slight forward lean, the posture of someone who had spent 15 years bending over engines in a low-ceilinged garage. His hands were permanently darkened at the knuckles, not from dirt. He scrubbed them each evening with the obsessive care of a surgeon, but from oil that had worked its way into the skin over years of patient, intimate labor. He had brown hair that he parted on the left without looking in a mirror, and a quiet face that people tended to forget within an hour of meeting him. He had grown up in the village of Sokoł, a settlement of perhaps 300 people nestled between river-cut hills in central Poland. His father had run the only garage in the district, a 2-bay operation that smelled of grease and petrol and the particular sweetness of warm rubber. And Stefan had grown up in it the way other children grew up in fields or churches. By the age of 12, he could disassemble and reassemble a 4-cylinder engine blindfolded, not as a trick, as practice. His father had believed, with the conviction of a religious man, that a mechanic who needed to see his work was a mechanic who did not yet truly understand it. A machine, his father used to say, talks to you through your fingers. You have to listen. Stefan had listened his whole life. When the Germans arrived in the autumn of 1939, Stefan did not run. He had a wife, Marta, and a daughter of 7 named Zofia, and he had the garage. The garage was what saved him initially. The Germans needed vehicles maintained, and Stefan was the best mechanic within 30 kilometers. They gave him a yellow work permit, which meant he could move through checkpoints without being shot. They called him der Mechaniker, the mechanic, and they treated him the way men treat a useful tool, without cruelty, but without any recognition that the tool had a soul. For 3 years, Stefan repaired German trucks, half-tracks, and motorcycles. He smiled when he was supposed to smile. He nodded when he was supposed to nod. He learned enough German to understand command without appearing to understand too much. And he watched. He watched with the careful, systematic attention of a man trained to diagnose problems by studying symptoms. He watched how the soldiers behaved when they thought no one was looking. He watched which officers were disciplined and which were lazy. He watched the paperwork that accompanied each vehicle, the manifests, the requisition forms, the maintenance schedules. He kept none of this in writing, because written things could be found. He kept it all in the same place. His father had taught him to keep the most important knowledge in his hands and in his head. The moment that changed everything was not dramatic. It came on a cold Tuesday in February 1943, when a German sergeant named Brandt brought in a damaged truck and mentioned, while watching Stefan work, that there was a big operation coming in the east. Something with tanks, something that would end the war in 6 months. He said it with the casual confidence of a man who has been told what he wants to hear by people who needed him to remain confident. Stefan nodded and kept his eyes on the engine. That evening he walked to the edge of the forest east of town and made a sound with his teeth, a specific clicking pattern, and waited. After 7 minutes, a man emerged from the tree line. His name was Henryk Bake, and he was the local courier for the Armia Krajowa, the Polish Home Army. They spoke for 4 minutes without looking directly at each other, like 2 men who happened to be standing near the same tree. 3 weeks later, Stefan received the folder. He read its contents twice, closed it, and sat for a long time in the dark of his garage. Then he said yes. The reasons he gave himself were practical. He had the skills. He had the access, and he had the yellow work permit. But there was another reason, one he did not say aloud, one that lived in the place behind the eyes where men keep the things they are not fully ready to name. His daughter Zofia had stopped laughing the way she used to laugh. The occupation had done that. It had pressed something out of children across Poland, some quality of lightness that children were supposed to carry without even knowing they were carrying it. And Stefan had decided, quietly, without announcing it to anyone, that he was not willing to let the people who had done that win. The briefing document told him what the target was. It told him where the train was. It told him approximately how many guards were present. What it did not tell him was how to destroy it, because the men who wrote the briefing had concluded that destroying it was not possible. Stefan spent the first 4 days doing something that looked, to anyone watching, like nothing at all. He drove his old delivery truck along the roads east of Radom on the pretense of visiting a supplier in the next district. A genuine supplier, a genuine business errand, the kind of cover that works precisely because it requires no acting. He drove slowly. He stopped at the side of the road 3 times to check a tire that did not need checking. He ate his lunch on a fallen tree and watched the tree line. The Germans had built a temporary rail spur off the main Warsaw-Krakow line in 1942, originally to supply a construction project that had since been abandoned. The spur ran 3 kilometers into a dense pine forest before ending at a loading platform. The forest provided natural concealment from the air. The single entry track meant the train could not be ambushed conventionally. Any explosion on the track would simply trap it in place, and the 43 guards would become 43 men defending a fixed and well-supplied position while waiting for reinforcements that were never more than 2 hours away. You could not blow up the track. You could not attack the guards. You could not approach from the air. Conventional analysis was correct. A conventional attack was impossible. Stefan was not thinking conventionally. On the 5th day, he visited a man named Tadeusz Mroz, who operated a small sawmill 12 kilometers from the rail spur. Tadeusz was 60 years old, half-deaf from years of machinery, and utterly trusted by the local Home Army cell. More importantly, he had spent 2 years before the war working as a maintenance laborer for the Polish National Railway. He knew trains the way Stefan knew trucks. They talked for 3 hours over tea that had not contained actual tea leaves in 2 years. Stefan asked questions. Tadeusz answered them with the pleasure of a man who had not been asked the right questions in a very long time. The next morning, Stefan sat in his garage before dawn and built a diagram in his head. Not on paper, never on paper, but in the same 3-dimensional space behind his eyes where he had always held engine schematics. The train was loaded and stationary. It had been sitting on the spur for 11 days, waiting for clearance to move east. The engine, a German Class 52 steam locomotive, would need to be under steam pressure before it could move. That process took approximately 90 minutes from a cold start. The Germans maintained what Tadeusz called a warm standby, meaning the boiler was kept at low pressure, not full, to reduce coal consumption. From warm standby to full operational pressure, 35 minutes. The guards rotated in 3 shifts. The shift change happened at 2 a.m., 8 a.m., and 4 p.m. The 2 a.m. shift change was the vulnerable one. Both the outgoing and incoming guards were at their worst, and the forest was at its darkest. Stefan's plan did not involve explosives. It did not involve firearms. It involved a 2-liter metal canister, a length of copper tubing, 3 specific tools from his workbench, and a mechanical understanding that perhaps 5 other men in the district possessed. He was going to let the train destroy itself. A steam locomotive's boiler is a precisely engineered pressure vessel. Its safety is maintained by a series of relief valves, mechanical devices that open automatically if internal pressure exceeds safe limits, venting steam and preventing catastrophic failure. Remove those valves, replace them with sealed fittings that cannot open, and then allow the boiler to reach full pressure with nowhere for excess steam to go, and the result is not an explosion in the dramatic movie sense. It is something worse, a sudden, total, uncontrolled failure of a vessel containing superheated steam and hundreds of kilograms of water under enormous pressure. The locomotive would destroy itself. The force of the failure would derail the front cars. A derailment, if positioned correctly at the right point on the spur, would block any other train from reaching the cargo. The cargo would be stranded. And by the time anyone understood what had happened, it would be a mechanical accident. It would be a mechanical accident. No saboteur, no attack. Just a failed boiler that someone had, apparently, incorrectly maintained. Stefan looked at his hands in the early morning light. He thought of Zofia. He went to work. He moved on the night of June 8th, which gave him 2 nights of darkness before the train was scheduled to depart. He left the house at 11 p.m., telling Marta he needed to check on the truck engine, which was running rough. She looked at him for a moment longer than she usually would have. She had been his wife for 11 years. She knew him in the way. Only people who have loved someone quietly and attentively for a long time come to know them, not through what he said, but through the precise temperature of how he said it. "Be careful," she said. Just that. He carried his tools in a canvas bag that also contained 2 clean rags, a tin of grease, and a legitimate German maintenance requisition form that he had carefully altered, changing the vehicle type and destination using ink matched to the original. The form was his last line of defense. If he was stopped and questioned, he was a licensed repair technician responding to an equipment fault. He had memorized the garb rotation from 11 days of careful observation. He had memorized the timing of the forest path that ran parallel to the rail spur used by local woodcutters before the occupation, and now overgrown but passable. He had counted his steps from the tree line to the locomotive on 2 previous reconnaissance passes, each time in the guise of foraging for mushrooms, an entirely normal activity, one that even German soldiers understood, because Central European men forage for mushrooms the way they breathe air. The night was cool and overcast, no moon. The pine trees were close together and the ground underneath them was soft, with years of fallen needles, which meant his footsteps made almost no sound. He reached the edge of the camouflage netting at 12:47 a.m. He lay flat and waited. The guard rotation he had observed was consistent. 2 soldiers patrolled the perimeter of the netting in opposite directions, meeting every 8 minutes at the north corner before continuing. A third guard was positioned at the locomotive cab, seated, and from the quality of his stillness had been asleep on the last 2 nights by 12:30 a.m. 2 others were visible near the rear cars. 43 guards total. At any given moment between midnight and 1 a.m., perhaps 6 or 7 were actively moving. Stefan waited 17 minutes, watching the intersection of the 2 perimeter guards' paths, counting seconds between their passing. His breathing was even, his hands were steady. He had discovered something about himself during the 3 years of occupation that he had never known before. That under genuine danger, he became very calm, not numb, calm. The way an engine becomes quietest right before it reaches optimal running temperature. At 1004 a.m., he moved under the netting. The distance from the netting's edge to the locomotive was approximately 35 meters. He covered it in a crawl, using the shadows of the cargo cars for cover, moving only when the perimeter guards were at their furthest points from him. It took 11 minutes. He covered the last 2 meters to the locomotive's far side on his stomach, pulling himself along with his forearms. The guard in the cab was asleep, his rifle resting against the side window of the cab, his chin on his chest. Stefan rose into a crouch at the far side of the locomotive's boiler housing. The access point he needed was on the underside of the boiler assembly, a maintenance panel that could be reached from beneath the locomotive. He had confirmed its position from a technical schematic that Teasas had drawn from memory with the unnerving precision of a man who had spent years staring at these machines. He lowered himself beneath the locomotive and lay on his back in the gravel between the rails. The heat from the boiler was immediate and significant. Even at low pressure, the metal was warm to the touch. He felt the warmth through his jacket and the back of his neck. He found the first relief valve by touch. His fingers moved with complete confidence. He was listening, the way his father had taught him, through his fingertips. The first valve came free after 40 seconds of careful work. He seated the replacement fitting, a sealed brass cap, machined to exact specifications by Tadis's son-in-law, who was a lathe operator and who had been told he was making parts for a water pump, and tightened it by hand, then by tool, checking twice. He was reaching for the second valve when he heard footsteps, not the steady, expected rhythm of the perimeter guards. These were different, closer, more purposeful, slightly irregular, someone moving with a specific destination rather than a route. Stefan went completely still. The footsteps stopped 2 meters away on the far side of the locomotive. He heard the unmistakable sound of a locomotive. He heard the unmistakable sound of a match being struck, and then the small hiss of a cigarette being lit. One of the off-duty guards, unable to sleep, out for a smoke. Stefan did not move. He lay beneath an active boiler in the dark, with one valve already removed and the second half disassembled in his hands, listening to a German soldier smoke a cigarette not 2 meters from his head. The cigarette took approximately 4 minutes. He knew this because he counted seconds. He had found that counting was useful in situations like this, not because the number mattered, but because it gave the mind something to do that was not imagining everything that could go wrong. The soldier spat once, stepped on the cigarette, and walked back toward the rear cars. Stefan released a breath so slowly it made almost no sound. He completed the second valve replacement in 90 seconds and began working on the third and final relief valve, the primary one, the largest, positioned at the top crown of the boiler assembly, just above where he was lying. This one was more difficult to reach. He had to shift his position, angling his body along the inner rail, with one shoulder pressed against the bottom of the boiler housing, reaching upward with both hands in a space barely wide enough for his forearms. He had prepared for this. He had practiced the motion for 2 nights in his garage, lying under his truck with similar-sized fittings until he could complete it without looking and without rushing. The valve came free. He worked the replacement fitting on with patient, deliberate movements. He was tightening the final turn when he felt the replacement cap shift slightly under his fingers, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement that told him the threading was not seating correctly. He stopped, checked with 2 fingers. The cap had cross-threaded. If he continued tightening, he risked stripping the threads entirely and either leaving an obvious sign of tampering or, worse, failing to seal the valve at all. He backed the cap off 3 full turns and started again. His hands were very steady. The second attempt seated correctly. He tightened it to specification, not too tight, not too loose, and checked it twice more before allowing himself to believe it was done. He replaced his tools in the canvas bag in the exact order he had taken them out, wiped the areas he had worked with the clean rag, and pressed his ear briefly against the boiler housing. The warm throb of pressurized water, the quiet, oblivious life of a machine that did not yet know what had been done to it. He slid out from beneath the locomotive and lay still in the gravel for 30 seconds, listening. Then he moved back toward the netting's edge, again using the shadow of the cargo cars, again counting his seconds, again completely calm. He was under the netting and back in the trees by 1:52 a.m. He walked home through the forest in the dark, following a path he knew by the feel of the ground under his boots, and he did not allow himself to think about what would happen next. There was a habit he had learned from years of mechanical work. When a job was done, it was done. You did not second-guess a repair while walking away from it. You had checked it twice. Now you trusted your work. He reached his house at 3:10 a.m. Marta was awake, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands folded. She looked at him once, and then she put the kettle on. They sat together in the kitchen and did not speak about anything important. She talked about Sophia's drawing lesson. He talked about a carburetor he was going to rebuild the next day. They drank their tea. Outside, the night was very quiet. The train departed the spur at 6:15 a.m. on June 10th, 2 days after Stefan's visit, having received its final clearance authorization from the Wehrmacht Supply Command in Warsaw. The driver brought the boiler to full operational pressure over the preceding 35 minutes, following standard warm-up procedure. The safety instruments read normal throughout, which was correct because Stefan had not altered the instruments. He had altered the valves. The instruments were measuring real pressure. They simply had no mechanism left to do anything about it. The locomotive had traveled approximately 4 kilometers down the main line, heading southeast toward Kielce, when the boiler reached a pressure threshold that its compromised relief system could not manage. The failure took 3 seconds. To the crew in the cab, there was a sound like a great intake of breath, and then a white wall of superheated steam that moved faster than any of them could have moved away from it. The locomotive left the rails and drove itself into the embankment at the left side of the track with a force that crumpled the front of the engine like paper. The first 2 cargo cars jackknifed behind it, one lifting almost vertical before falling across the main line. No one in the cab survived. 12 of the 43 guards were in the forward cars. Of those, 7 were injured by the derailment. No others were killed by the initial event. What followed was chaos. The German response assumed sabotage, which was correct, but assumed sabotage of the conventional kind, a planted explosive device. This meant the initial response was a security sweep of the surrounding area looking for triggermen or observation posts. They found none because there were none. The sweep wasted 4 hours. The second assumption was that the damage to the track was repairable quickly. This was incorrect. The first cargo car that had jackknifed had come down at an angle that drove its undercarriage deep into the track bed, destroying not just the rails but the timber foundation beneath them. A repair crew from Kielce was summoned. They arrived at 4 p.m. and assessed the situation. Their report concluded that the track would require a minimum of 72 hours to repair. 72 hours was a geological era in the context of the operation the cargo was meant to support. The fuel, the shells, the engine components, all of it sat in a field beside a destroyed rail line in central Poland, under guard but completely immobile. The Wehrmacht Supply Command in Warsaw sent urgent messages to Berlin. Berlin sent messages back asking for explanations. The explanations were inadequate because the initial investigation, focusing entirely on external sabotage, had not yet examined the boiler's internal valve assembly. When a technical inspector finally examined the wreckage on June 12th, he found what appeared to be a defective replacement fitting on one of the relief valves, the kind of part that might have been installed by an overworked maintenance crew using substandard wartime materials. The report he filed described a probable mechanical failure due to faulty components. It mentioned the possibility of sabotage as a secondary theory, but noted the lack of any supporting evidence. The Supply Command accepted the mechanical failure explanation with the exhausted gratitude of a bureaucracy desperate for a narrative that did not require them to admit that a critical supply train had been compromised under the noses of 43 guards. The consequence of the delay was small in the abstract and significant in the specific. The armored division that Leiferdung 1 had been designated to support was forced to begin the opening phase of the Kursk operation with reduced fuel reserves, requiring a more conservative initial advance than planned. The logistical disruption rippled through the supply chain for 11 days. 3 other trains were rerouted to compensate, pulling resources from 2 other sectors. No battle is decided by a single act. No war is won by a single sabotage. But history, when examined closely enough, is made of exactly these kinds of moments, small acts of precision that open cracks in the machinery of overwhelming force, and through which larger consequences flow. The Home Army courier who received the report of the train's derailment passed it up the chain as a completed action of unknown origin. The British radio operators who relayed the confirmation message did not know the name of the individual involved. The Polish commanders who received the news noted it as a successful interdiction of supply logistics, Category 3, and moved on to the next file. Stefan Kowal returned to work the morning after the train departed. He rebuilt a carburetor, he replaced brake pads on a German supply truck. He charged a reasonable price and received his payment and said nothing of interest to anyone. In the weeks that followed, the German security apparatus conducted 2 sweeps of the Sopkow district, questioning locals about suspicious activity near the rail lines. Stefan was questioned once, briefly, by a corporal who was more interested in getting back to his lunch than in the interrogation. Stefan's yellow work permit was examined. His alibi, confirmed by Marta, by his supplier in the next district, by the legitimate maintenance requisition form he had filled out that night, was coherent and unremarkable. He was released after 20 minutes. He went home and ate dinner with his family. He continued to work for the Home Army through 1944, contributing to 4 additional operations, all of them in the same style, quiet, mechanical, calibrated to look like accidents. He never fired a weapon during the war. He never wore a uniform. He never appeared on any list of fighters or heroes because he had no interest in appearing on such lists, and because the best kind of invisible work is the kind that remains invisible. When the war ended in 1945, Stefan Kowal reopened his garage. The building had been damaged by a passing artillery exchange in the final weeks of the conflict. A section of roof gone, one wall cracked, and he repaired it himself over the course of a summer. He expanded the operation slightly in 1951, adding a 3rd bay for larger vehicles. He trained 2 apprentices. He retired in 1968 and spent the following years building small mechanical toys for his grandchildren. He never talked about the war, not to his children, not to his grandchildren, not to the younger men who sometimes asked. He would listen to their questions with that same quiet face and then say something mild and deflecting, and they would find themselves, somehow, talking about something else entirely. Marta knew. Tadeusz Braz knew. Henryk Bocki, the courier who died in 1961, had known. The German technical report on the derailment of Lieferlines remained classified in West German military archives until 1979, when a historian researching Kursk-era logistics accessed it as part of a broader study. He noted the discrepancy between the mechanical failure explanation and several physical details in the inspection photographs that suggested deliberate alteration of the valve assemblies. He mentioned it in a footnote. The footnote was not widely read. The history books about the Battle of Kursk describe it as a Soviet strategic victory, the turning point on the Eastern Front, the moment when German offensive capacity in the East was broken permanently. They described the fuel shortages that limited initial German advances. They described the supply chain failures that compounded those shortages. The footnotes on those footnotes, if followed far enough, lead back to a 2-week window in June 1943 and a cascade of logistical disruptions whose origin no document ever fully explained. They do not lead back to Sokow. They do not lead back to a low-ceiling garage smelling of oil and warm rubber. They do not lead back to a man lying on his back in the dark, beneath a machine too loud and self-important to know it was already beaten, working by feel alone, listening with his fingers. Stefan Kowal died in 1983, 74 years old, in the same village where he was born. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his garage, his family, and his reputation as the finest mechanic in the district. It mentioned that he had been well liked. It mentioned nothing else. Somewhere in a box in his daughter Zofia's house, Zofia, who had laughed again, eventually, and whose own children had grown up in a world that did not occupy them, there was a canvas tool bag with a faint grease stain near the bottom seam. Zofia did not know what the bag had been used for. She kept it because it had been her father's, and because it smelled of the garage where she had spent her childhood, and because some things are worth keeping even when you cannot say exactly why. The bag sat in the box. The box sat in the house. The house stood quiet under the Polish sky. And the war, as it always does, remained present in the objects left behind by people who were ordinary enough to be forgotten, and extraordinary enough to have mattered, in the spaces between the names on the monuments, in the margins of the histories, in the mechanisms of the world whose gears still turn the way they do because someone, somewhere, once understood machines well enough to know exactly how to stop them.